or listen in on your phone. If you choose to call in, please dial the phone number listed. After about a 30 to 35-minute presentation, we will open up the forum for questions. You may submit questions at any point by simply typing your question on the question box and clicking send. At the end of the presentation, we will go through and answer as many questions as we can. For any questions we don't get to, or if you have any questions after today, we will list staff contact information at the end of the presentation, and you may contact them to follow up. Please note that today's presentation is being recorded and will be made available online at planningforla.org, as well as on our department's YouTube channel, Planning for LA. Before we begin, please make sure you are able to access a handout we've made available via the webinar platform. The sheet is titled Home Sharing Ordinance Useful Links. We may reference this sheet during today's presentation, and it's a helpful tool to have as you navigate through the ordinance and the registration process. And as far as today's topic, we understand there may be some confusion about the city's ordinance, and also understand that the adoption of the city's home sharing ordinance affects many people in many different ways. This presentation is intended to cover topics for both hosts, potential hosts, as well as neighbors affected by the ordinance. We want to recognize that people may be here to learn and ask questions about various aspects of the home sharing ordinance. And as mentioned, please feel free to submit questions during and after the presentation, and we will do our best to make sure they are answered. So very briefly, we want to go over today's agenda. First, we'll review some background information about the policy behind the city's regulations, including more context on how a motion for the home sharing ordinance was initiated and how the home sharing ordinance came to be adopted. We'll go over what activities are covered by the ordinance, what the rules are, and how to determine if you are eligible for the home sharing program. We'll also cover effective dates for these rules and what will and what has happened post-effective date of the ordinance. Next, we'll spend some time talking about the rules for hosts, how enforcement is handled, and how we'll deal with any issues related to compliance with the ordinance. We'll then spend some time talking about what extended home sharing is and how that program will be implemented. And then finally, we'll spend some time looking ahead to highlight what else may be considered for the home sharing ordinance. Following all of that, we will have our question and answer portion of our webinar. So today we are joined by the city planning staff who worked on drafting the home sharing ordinance, as well as staff who is currently implementing the adopted rules. We have City Planner Matt Glesney from our City Planning Citywide Housing Policy Division. We also have City Planning Associate Callie Hardy, who's also from our Citywide Housing Policy Division. And we also have Principal City Planner Bob Duenas from our Development Services Centers. This is where the implementation and enforcement of the home sharing ordinance is located. And I'm Jenna Monterosa, City Planner and Council Liaison for Los Angeles City Planning.
From here, we'll start by giving some context about the short-term rental industry in Los Angeles. Prior to the city's home sharing ordinance, the short-term rental housing was technically illegal, but there were very few regulations and ability to enforce the ordinance, and therefore there were very few protections in place. And to back up, when we're speaking about short-term rentals, we're talking about the market of a listing, a unit, or home for less than 30 consecutive days. So what we're not talking about are long-term leases, where we have existing landlord and tenant protections in place. Short-term rental activity has been steadily rising and is concentrated in the city's entire home listings, which has created growing concerns over the loss of the city's long-term housing supply, especially in areas where we've had the highest concentration of listings. And you can see the numbers on the slide. These are of last year. We had about 33,000 listings in the city, which was an increase of about 50% over the last 2 years. About 55% of those short-term rental listings are multifamily. 69% were listed as the entire home and not a shared room or a private room. And about 9,200 of those units were listed more than 120 days a year, which we'll discuss later in reference to the cap. As we know, short-term rentals is a controversial topic. There are many benefits to short-term rentals, and there are many challenges. Some of the benefits we've heard about include providing additional household income for many families. The extra income has been very helpful. It also allows for the efficient use of extra space that may be available. And third, we've heard about home sharing promoting social interaction and cultural tourism some of our neighborhoods. Some of the challenges we've heard about are probably most significantly around our housing supply. We face a housing crisis and a lack of housing supply in the city of Los Angeles, and the concern about losing units has been at the top of mind of policymakers, as well as the potential for nuisances and party houses. And there's also concerns about changes to the city's residential character of our neighborhoods. As certain neighborhoods become very popular for short-term rental use, they may lose some of their residential feeling. So as I mentioned, some of the prior regulations really dealt with traditional short-term rental industries like the hotel and motel industry, but short-term rentals and home sharing really was not regulated. So the only places where 30-day rentals were allowed prior to this ordinance were in hotels and motels, something called a transient occupancy residential structure, which is essentially a hotel that is allowed to have a kitchen. Both of those uses were allowed through a conditional use permit only in certain zones, largely in R4 zones or above. Lastly, we also had an allowance for bed and breakfasts, which are only allowed in designated historical buildings through a conditional use permit. But besides those uses, home sharing was not an allowed use or short-term rental. So about 4 years ago, we received direction from the City Council to do something about this issue. The council motion came from our council members Bonin, Wesson, and Koretz on June 2nd, 2015. The motion directed the City Planning Department to create short-term rental regulations that would, number one, authorize hosts to rent in their primary residence. 2, to prohibit short-term rentals in buildings subject to the Rent Stabilization Ordinance, or RSO. And 3rd, we were asked to create an ordinance that would capture transient occupancy tax, or TOT tax, or sometimes called hotel tax. So the Planning Department took that direction and drafted a proposed ordinance. The ordinance was available for public comment for about 3 years. The final ordinance was adopted in December 2018 with an effective date of July 1st, 2019. And in June and July, the department indicated that the enforcement would begin of the ordinance in full on November 1st, 2019. So what is covered by the home sharing ordinance? The home sharing ordinance covers rental stays of less than 30 days, or 30 days or less. Any stay of more than 30 days is not covered by the ordinance. We're talking about short-term rentals of one's primary residence. So as I mentioned, we are not talking about stays of more than 31 days or more. Stays of 31 days or more are completely unregulated by the home sharing ordinance and may continue and are treated like a regular long-term rental agreement. We're also not talking about legally established hotels, motels, bed and breakfasts, and the transient occupancy structures, which were already permitted and not affected by the ordinance. So now we'll get into how one can qualify for home sharing under the home sharing program. But first of all, a host needs to demonstrate that they are the primary residents of the unit that they wish to do home sharing in. There is a small exception where pre-2017 accessory dwelling units, or ADUs, do not need to be the primary residence. You can live in the main home and rent out your ADU as home sharing if the ADU was permitted prior to 2017, January 2017, I should say. The second main qualification is that the residence is located in a zone that permits residential housing. That's most of the city, however, not in our manufacturing and industrial zones or open space zones and a few other zones that do not permit housing. But housing is permitted in our commercial zones and our residential zones. Third, housing cannot be subject to the Rent Stabilization Ordinance, or RSO. No listings of RSO or rent control units are permitted. Units are subject to the rent control ordinance generally if they're in a building that is built before 1978 and where there are more than 2 or more units on the lot. It's generally subject to rent control. Buildings with a temporary exemption, sometimes called a T1 exemption, for being owner-occupied are still subject to the rent control or rent stabilization ordinance, and therefore home sharing is not permitted in those units with a temporary exemption. Fourth, a unit cannot be subject to a restricted affordable housing covenant or have had an Ellis Act conversion to a single-family home within the last 5 years. These are both protections of the city's affordable housing stock. Fifth, if you are a tenant and wish to do home sharing, you will need to have your landlord approval. That is just through a written document that we've provided through the home sharing administrative guidelines and available on our website. It's just a signed approval from your landlord. And lastly, you need to be legally registered as a host within the city. That means you need to come and register through the city's online registration portal and have a registration number. Okay, we wanted to talk about the primary residence, as this is a core component of the ordinance. As mentioned, all home sharing units need to occur in a primary residence, except for that narrow ADU exclusion I mentioned. Primary residence is defined as the residence where host resides more than 6 months of the year. So a host can only have one primary residence where they live more than half the year. Generally, we're talking about the property associated with the address where the host resides. If there are multiple units on a property, the primary residence is the unit in which the host resides. When it comes to detached structures, home sharing is permitted in any space approved for residential use. This may include a backyard accessory structure that is considered safe and habitable by the Department of Building and Safety, if it is associated with your address and not a full accessory dwelling unit permitted after 2017. What is prohibited is using parts of the property that are not approved for residential use and therefore not safe and habitable. And we're talking about structures such as garages or recreational vehicles, storage rooms, attics, or other temporary structures where residential use is generally not permitted. Now, we'd like to talk about some of the additional home sharing regulations. Once you've been registered as a host, the following regulations would apply to host. First off, there's a 120 hosted day limit per calendar year. That is, everybody with a regular home sharing permit can rent less than 30 days for a cumulative total of 120 days per calendar year. That number would reset at the beginning of a calendar year, and another 120 days would be permitted as long as you are registered. Second, there's a maximum of 2 adults per habitable room. This is an occupancy limit that will be stated on your registration certificate when you are registered and receive your final registration. This information is based on the number of habitable rooms that hosts tell us and through their application process that they have in the property. And the administrative guidelines explain exactly what a habitable room is. It's generally any room except for a kitchen, storage rooms, or bathrooms, generally where sleeping and living can occur. That occupancy limit does not include children, so unlimited amount of children are allowed to exceed that occupancy limit. Third, there's a limit on one set of guests being booked at a time on a property. So while hosts may have multiple listings, they can only rent one of those listings to one set of guests at a time. The concern was that homes with multiple set of guests begins to resemble a boarding house or a hotel situation, which is not the intent of the home sharing ordinance. Fourth, the ordinance prohibits commercial uses or events under home sharing. So these would be renting of homes for events for profit purposes, sell products, other commercial uses are not covered under home sharing. And last, there's no commercial uses or events allowed as part of home sharing, and there are also restrictions on late night outdoor congregations that may lead to noise violations. Additional hosting responsibilities include maintaining the safety of the unit. That is, the installation of working fire extinguishers, smoke detectors, and carbon monoxide detectors. This should be certified through an affidavit at the time of registration. Additionally, the ordinance requires that a code of conduct be established and present on the premises, outlining the basic responsibilities of guests as they stay in your property, as well as an indication of emergency numbers and emergency exits. Hosts must also post their registration number on all of their listings for short-term rental in the city. Most platforms have a place for you to put your registration number, but that registration number does need to be included somewhere on the listing for it to be a legal listing for short-term rental in Los Angeles. And last, the ordinance asks hosts to take responsibility for any nuisance behavior that may occur during the home sharing. Next, we'd like to talk about the home sharing registration process. The City of Los Angeles Planning Department has set up an online registration portal at the website you can see below. You can also find the portal by going to the main Department of City Planning website and looking for the home sharing icon. The online registration portal will take you through a series of steps to document that you are the primary residence and meet the other requirements of the ordinance. Documentation required through the process to verify primary residence includes a valid federal or state-issued photo ID, as well as a proof of primary residency. If your valid federal state photo ID address matches the address where home sharing is occurring, you will only need one additional piece of primary residence documentation. However, if there is not a match, 2 additional documents will be needed. In addition, the landlord approval will be asked for if you are a tenant. That again is a form that can be uploaded through the online portal. Third, we'd ask that you agree and affirmatively declare that you are in alignment and in conformance with all the home sharing regulations. We will also check that there are no open or pending citations at the property. The idea is that an unsafe situation should be resolved and citations should be resolved before home sharing registration may occur. At the end of the process, you are asked to pay the $89 application fee, which can be done through credit card or ACH electronic checking. And finally, there's a process to ensure that transient occupancy tax, or TOT, is collected. In most cases, platforms may already be collecting on behalf of the hosts. If not, you would indicate as such through the portal, and your information will be transferred to the Office of Finance, where that process will begin, and they will send you out information to register you for paying the TOT. Additional considerations during the registration process include that hosts may not apply for more than one home sharing registration number. There's a limit generally, again, to a primary residence, and so the idea is every host should only have one address or one location where home sharing may occur. Hosts may register for more than one listing, as mentioned. However, they must include each website and URL on our registration portal. So you can have a listing for a 1-bedroom, and you could have a separate listing for a 2-bedroom, but each of those listings must include the registration number, and you must also inform the city about those websites and those URLs through the portal system. And again, your pending registration number or your final registration number must be posted on all listings on all home sharing platforms to ensure compliance. Next, we'll talk about compliance and enforcement of the home sharing ordinance. So the home sharing ordinance created new proactive enforcement tools that complement the city's existing enforcement. This includes use of a process called the Administrative Citation Enforcement Program, or ACE. The ACE program is developed as a way to issue citations without resulting in a criminal liability. It's under the Civil Code. The system is set up to issue warnings if the department finds a home sharing listing that is not registered with the city or otherwise not permitted. The city would be sending a warning letter to hosts and to property owners and to hosting platforms indicating that the listing should be removed or fines could commence. The system also enforces the 120-day cap that was mentioned, assuming that the host has not applied for extended home sharing, which does allow for year-round home sharing beyond the cap, and we'll cover that extended home sharing permit later. So as again, we're approaching November 1st, and November 1st is the day that enforcement is set to be initiated. So we encourage everyone to please register and put those registration numbers on your listing before November 1st. The ordinance does provide specific fines for violations of the home sharing ordinance. This includes a $500 daily fine or 2 times the nightly rate, whichever is greater, for advertising a unit for short-term rental without a valid registration number. Fines are only levied after warning letters are issued and no action is taken to remedy. And just to be clear what a citation is defined as any violation or administrative citation related to the property condition or activities at the property as issued by the city's enforcement agencies, including the Los Angeles Police Department, HZLA, which is the Housing Department, Los Angeles Building and Safety, LADBS, or the Los Angeles Fire Department. There are additional fines for listing beyond the 120-day cap without a valid extended home sharing registration. Those fines are the greater of $2,000 per day or 2 times the nightly rate, whichever is greater. In addition, there are a separate set of citations and fines for hosting platforms that book illegal listings or do not provide data in compliance with the ordinance. Next, we'll talk about suspensions and revocations of your home sharing permit. Registered hosts that receive 2 sustained citations in the registered year will be suspended for 30 days. Again, we've mentioned what citations are, but these can be violations for the city's party house ordinance, any nuisance citations, or any code citation by the city's code enforcement agencies. 2 of those in a year will result in an automatic suspension for 30 days. Hosts receiving 3 sustained citations in a year will be revoked and will be ineligible to apply for 1 year from the date of the revocation. In addition, any egregious or nuisance violations outside of these parameters may also be subject to added operational conditions or discontinuance of use based on the city's administrative nuisance abatement process. This would be an action brought by the planning department where there's an opportunity for public hearings and to place conditions on the use of the property or to discontinue and revoke the permit. Next, we'll talk about the extended home sharing process, or EHS as we're calling it. So extended home sharing allows for home sharing 365 days per year. This allows one to go beyond the regular 120-day cap for regular home sharing. Extended home sharing is only available for hosts who have been registered with the city for 6 months or who have already been registered and hosted for 60 days. The online registration portal will ask for you to submit that documentation for the 60 days. The city will have record if you've been registered for 6 months. The extended home sharing registration is done through the online registration portal, just like the regular home sharing. And once granted, it's valid for 1 year from the time of issuance. And there would be need to renew that on an annual basis, just like the regular home sharing. The extended home sharing does cost $850 to register, and that fee also applies to the annual renewal. The extended home sharing portal is available now online through the city's online registration portal. I should also mention that hosts are ineligible if their home sharing registration has been suspended or revoked in the last year. I should also mention that extended home sharing may not be available for hosts where their registration has been suspended or revoked in the prior 2 years. The extended home sharing process includes 2 possible different processes depending on whether there have been citations at the property. The first process that most folks will go through is called a ministerial or a by right approval. This is available for hosts who have received no more than 1 verified citation in the last 3 years. The process requires a notification to adjacent and abutting owners and occupants. They are not asked to comment or otherwise provide their opinion on the home sharing registration. It is just a notification. In addition, we've mentioned the $850 application fee and the ability to complete the registration online. The second process for extended home sharing is called the discretionary approval process. This process is required for hosts who have had 2 or more verified citations in the last 3 years. This process is a bit more involved and does require the same notification of adjacent and abutting neighbors, but also may require a public hearing. This is optional by the Department of City Planning based on case-specific factors and whether a public hearing would be necessary to find more facts about the home sharing application. This discretionary process does allow the department to condition the approval, which would mean putting conditions on perhaps the operation or other limitations beyond what exists in the home sharing ordinance. The process also requires that the planning department make required findings that the use of extended home sharing is compatible with the neighborhood and is not expected to cause significant issues. This discretionary process is appealable and does include a higher fee to apply, $5,660. This process would also be completed online through the portal partially, but would also require an in-person filing with the Department of City Planning at our Development Services counter at 201 North Figueroa. We wanted to talk more about the suspension and revocation process as it relates to extended home sharing. So hosts that receive 2 sustained citations will be suspended from extended home sharing for 30 days or as long as 1 citation is open. Hosts receiving 3 sustained citations within a registration year will be revoked from the program. Next, we wanted to talk about the complaint process. Complaints about home sharing may be submitted by anyone at any time using the city's 24/7 complaint hotline, and the number is 213-267-7788. You can also reach this line through the 311 contact center, which is just dialing 311 or 213-472-3231. The complaint hotline will take your complaint and ask you to identify yourself and therefore receive a callback. That is not required. A complaint of current operating concerns, such as a party or other nuisances or other potential violations of the ordinance, will result in a call to the host and an attempt to resolve the situation. If the situation is not able to be successfully resolved, the complaint will then go to the appropriate enforcement agencies. So finally, we wanted to talk about what's next with the ordinance. There are some additional pending motions that were requested by various city council members to look at various amendments to the program. For example, Council Files 18-1245 and 18-1247 request that the City Planning Department look at the potential for expanding home sharing into certain owner-occupied small multifamily buildings that are subject to the RSO. Those reports are currently pending in the Planning and Land Use Management Committee of City Council, and the City Planning Department will be providing a report on those very soon. Next, we'd like to let you know how to stay connected. If you'd like to receive more information about these motions, the best way is to go to the LA City Clerk Connect website. At the Los Angeles City Clerk website, you can click on the Council File Management System. From there, you can type in those council file numbers that I mentioned on the prior slide, and you will then be taken to the page for those council files, at which point you can click the envelope to request email notifications of any action that occurs, including any forthcoming city council dates. This system also allows you to send comments to the council file and the city council for them to consider. You would just send a letter or an email to the city clerk and reference the council file numbers that I've just mentioned. Also, we wanted to mention a vacation rental ordinance that this Department of City Planning is also working on. Vacation rentals are being defined as short-term rentals of an owner-occupied dwelling unit that is lived in only intermittently by the owner and not used for long-term rentals. So these would be non-primary residences in certain types of dwelling units. This ordinance has not yet been released and would go through a complete public vetting process, but the proposed ordinance as drafted would regulate and allow for a class of non-primary residence vacation rentals in the city of Los Angeles. The ordinance would establish new restrictions on the number of licenses that the city would issue and may also establish a citywide cap to prevent wholesale conversion of long-term housing into vacation units. More information on the vacation rental ordinance will be forthcoming when the department releases the ordinance. Finally, we just wanted to go through some additional online resources that are available for hosts. We've mentioned the city's online registration portal, which is available through the Department of City Planning website. And here's a picture of what that looks like when you get there. We also wanted to mention the City Planning Department's Zone Information Map Access System, or ZEMIS. ZEMIS is a web-based mapping tool that provides zoning information for properties located in the city of Los Angeles. ZEMIS was developed by Los Angeles City Planning to assist businesses and residents in making better informed land use decisions. Using the street address, assessor parcel number, APN, or other identifiers of a property, the ZEMIS search tool looks up zoning requirements for users. You can find ZEMIS at zemis.lacity.org. Once you get to the ZEMIS site, you'll enter the address of the unit you're interested in registering. From there, you can find information on the zoning, including whether the property is zoned to allow for residential use. Again, these would be zones that usually start with R or C, although there is additional nuanced zones that the department can help you with if you're not sure. The ZEMIS tool can also show whether your unit is subject to the Rent Stabilization Ordinance, or RSO. You would click on the Housing tab to see whether your property is considered subject to the RSO according to the city. I'll just mention that this is the information that the department looks at when you submit an application, and if you feel there is a mistake and your property should not be subject to the Rent Stabilization Ordinance, the online registration portal does allow for you to submit additional information about why you feel your property is not subject, and then we will investigate.
And they said, no, it's 8 feet.
Okay, great. Thank you, Matt. So we're going to open it up to questions. You've been receiving questions during the webinar. We've been trying to answer those as they've come in. We have a few more coming in. So Bob Duenas is here, and he's going to be answer some of these questions that we have on our screen, and we'll read the question into the record or to the webinar for everybody to hear, and then we'll give an answer to that. So go ahead, Bob. Oh, let me do this. Let me read this, Bob. Okay.
No pressure.
So understanding we need proper documentation to show that our home is our primary residence. We are in the home buying process right now. So how long would you say we have to wait between purchase of our home to approval of registration number?
It's not necessarily. Excuse me, let me just fix my audio. It's not necessarily the time you have to wait. When you register, you just have to submit the documents to show proof of residency. Your driver's license would reflect your new address. If it does not, you submit a couple of the items to show that that is your residence, such as vehicle registration, tax bill, other documents as such. So there really is not a waiting period for that.
Okay. Next question here. The question says, or is asking, is it allowable to rent out for a minimum of 30 nights, or does it have to be 31 nights? Oh, I'm sorry. Here, let me kind of.
One moment. Okay, is it allowable to rent 31 nights? Okay, the short-term rental ordinance regulates any activity of 30 nights or less. Anything with 31 nights or more is not regulated by the short-term ordinance. So if you're doing even one activity of short-term rentals, yes, you would be required to have a registration number for that period. Next question.
You just
next
made it
question.
confusing
The
again.
question is, what does one set of guests mean? In this presentation, you stated hosting limitations. Maximum 2 adults per habitable room, one set of guests at a time. Can a host have multiple rooms rented out in the same booking reservation? For example, a booking is for a whole house with 3 bedrooms in it, or booking for a listing with 3 rooms in it. Of course, each habitable room will only have 2 guests in it. So can such bookings be for 6 people? I think the question is about multiple rooms being rented and multiple listings.
In reading the question, I assume you have a large facility. You will have one registration number for the entire home. You will describe your home, multiple rooms, one room, however it lays out for you. The key here is you can only have one transaction set of visitors coming
I
to
should
your
have waited
home
to send my
at
questions.
any one
to
given
actually-
time.
Well,
Whether that group has
they're
rented
still
one room
moderating.
or
it, so.
6 rooms isn't the issue. It's that transaction. So, for example, you have a guest coming from Florida as one entity. They can occupy the entire structure or just one bedroom. What you cannot have is one set of guests coming from Florida, another set of guests coming from Washington, independent of each other, not knowing each other, and occupying the space at the same time. So there is no overlapping of separate bookings allowed. Next question.
Okay, great. Oh, great. Thank you, Bob. Okay, next question. This is a question more about enforcement. The question is asking how the ACE program works. So can you explain how the enforcement through ACE will work?
Okay, currently, most of our land use regulations are cited by the Department of Building and Safety because it has to deal with construction, life safety issues. With the home sharing program, we're using the ACE program. It's regulated, or I should say operated, by the City Attorney's Office. When we identify hosts that are advertising on websites without a registration number, we will hopefully be able to inform them with a warning letter or two to encourage them to register. People who repeatedly advertise on a platform without a registration number will eventually receive a citation through the ACE program. What that does is create the fine system, $500 per event, or 2 times the rental rate, and it's also processed through the City Attorney's Office. they've set up a unit that can follow up on these and contact the property owners or hosts to help ensure compliance. But again, the main key here is that it's processed through the city attorney's office and not the Department of Building and Safety. Next question.
Okay, great, thank you. We have a few questions here that are asking about the 30 to 31 days, Bob. So maybe if you can go over the difference between rentals of up to 30 days and then rentals 31 days and more, because there's some nuances there. We want to make sure everybody is understanding the rules about these.
Okay, the short-term rental ordinance only regulates short-term rentals, which is defined 30 nights or less. So if you've registered and you're doing just weekend activities of renting your structure, that's fine. That's all short-term rentals. Those nights are counting towards your, hypothetically, your 120 days of rentals. If, say, there's a period in there where you rent a unit for, say, 3 months, more than 31 days, a big block of 3 months, that just falls under the regular apartment rental restrictions and limitations regulated by the housing department. They do not count towards your 120 days. All we're looking at is your short-term rental activity. And your platforms track this, you can track this, so it's easy to distinguish what's counting for short-term rentals and what is not. Some periods of the year, people rent their home or locations for long periods. Summer, they might rent them for short periods. So that's really the distinction. But you can be doing both within the same location. Next question.
Okay, this question is about the November 1st date. The question is, if one can't get a registration in place by November 1st, what happens to the existing short-term rental reservations and guests that already exist on the platforms?
Okay, currently we encourage everyone to come to the registration portal, register. If you qualify, you will get an immediate pending registration number, and you can instantly start applying that to your platforms, and you'll be in compliance. After we review your documents, you'll get a final registration number. But again, even with the pending, you're in full compliance. If for some chance you do not qualify because it is an RSO unit, rent restricted unit, not your primary residence, at that point you will not get a registration number and you will be out of compliance after November 1st, and you would not be able to execute those transactions afterwards. Next question.
Okay. This is a question from a neighbor. It says, I'm a neighbor of an apartment unit being used for home sharing. How can I find out if the unit is registered?
If you'd like to know if the unit is registered, first of all, what people do is sometimes if they want to know if it's short-term rental, they can sometimes call us up. We can look it up, but typically we are not set up to put that information out publicly. Maybe that's a service we'll be able to do in time, but currently we're focused on encouraging people to register and coming into compliance, and from there we'll hopefully expand services. Thank you.
Okay. Some of these are still about, the questions that are coming in are still about the rent stabilization ordinance and some questions about EDU. So let's just go over a few of them. One of them says, so in short, maybe just a verification, I cannot Airbnb my vacant units because they are built prior to 1978 and reside in the city of Los Angeles?
Yes, that would be correct.
Let's see here. How about for ADUs or a separate house, such as next door, do you need to register?
Yes, you do. Any short-term rental, whether it's your main house, an ADU, accessory habitable structure, all need a registration number, yes. Thank you.
So here's another question. If I rent the entire home and not live there, am I no longer allowed to rent short term?
No, you can rent your entire home for short-term rentals, but you do have to spend at least 6 months a year residing in that. Again, the key is it has to be your primary residence, and whether you're there all 6 months, the beginning of the year, and you short-term rental the latter part, or you pepper your residency throughout the year, totaling at least 6 months. Either way works. But yes, you can do your entire home or just one bedroom. Thank you.
Okay, here's a question. It says, what would stop a commercial host doing rentals to have many vacation homes in order to continue its commercial activity as a short-term rental? How would you curb the abuse of this ordinance? So I think this is a question about how do we keep vacation rentals from existing on the market?
Okay, that's a good question, and that's like a key element of this ordinance. When you register, you have to show proof of residency. One way of doing that is driver's license with the address of the site you're trying to register, and then a couple of supplemental documents. If you try to register another site, you would have to have those identical documents addressed and located for that other facility. How that would happen, I don't know. You'd have to probably make up documents. But at the same time, we would see the registrant's name pop up twice, and we would prevent that from occurring on multiple properties. You're only allowed to have one registration number in the city per person. These operators have approached us and wanted to know if they would still be permitted to collect leases, collect properties, and run it like you're describing a business. And we've had to tell them, no, that is the intent of this ordinance to prevent that from happening. We're trying to encourage long-term housing stock to come back online, and this is one way to do it.
Okay, great, thank you. Question about complaints. The question is, can complaints be submitted by email to city planning dash home sharing unit?
Okay, currently complaints, and it depends what your issue is on the complaint. You can call the complaint hotline, submit it there. There is a live person taking those phone calls. Typical complaints we hear from Homeshare sites is noise. The reason we have that 24-hour hotline is complaints don't occur at 3 in the afternoon. They occur at 2 in the morning. That way you're able to call, have it immediately addressed. They can either connect you with the police or they contact the host directly and try to correct the issue. Other types of complaints, depending on what it is, you can still call the police directly for noise or contact LADPBS directly and file a complaint with them. But I'd encourage people to use that hotline. Thank you.
Okay, there was a question here about registration. This person asked, if I made a mistake on registration as far as the number of habitable rooms in the application, can they change it? So can someone go back and correct what they've listed on their registration?
Okay, on that situation, I would encourage you to use host compliance support email that's located at the bottom of the registration. It's probably on your registration certificate. Send them an email, give them your registration number, your address, and your name. Tell them what the situation is, and they can most likely correct your registration. The reason we do that is for security reasons. We don't want just anyone being able to access somebody else's registration information. That's why it should come from the person and the email that was used on the original registration, and you're contacting host compliance directly. Thank you.
Okay. So this next question asks, I have a 4-bedroom home. Can I advertise one of the rooms for 31 days or more and the second room with no minimum stay? So a combination of long-term and short-term.
You have to have a registration.
Good question. Again, all we are going to regulate are your short-term stay activities. If you've got an occupant there staying for months at a time, 31 days or more, that is not considered short-term rental for that activity. So we are just looking at the activity of short-term rental.
Okay, a little bit more about the long term. It says, I have turned one of the listings in my house into a long term listing, i.e., I think 31 days or more. However, I have a couple of reservations for that unit from 6 months ago. The question is, can I fulfill those reservations? There are 2 reservations for 1 week and 10 days.
You can only fulfill your reservations of the ones for 1 week or 2 weeks if you have a short-term registration number posted on your site, on your advertising site. Activities of 31 days or more is not regulated.
Okay. Okay. Let's see. This is a question about landlord and tenant relationship. Can you hold the landlord accountable for its residents doing short-term rentals that were not approved by the landlord? Let's repeat that one. Okay, this question is, can you hold the landlord accountable for its residents doing short-term rentals that were not approved by the landlord?
Okay, ultimately, all activity on a property is the responsibility of the landlord. And of course, we're going to contact the landlord for any issues that are occurring on the property. And what we would like to see and meet with the landlord, they would tell us they've not approved it. They would have had to sign a notary granting that activity to the tenant. Obviously, if they did not sign that notary, they did not give the tenant permission. At that point, then enforcement goes against the tenant, and that's where the citations would go.
Okay, thank you. Okay, sorry folks. The next question is, are the 120 days allowed for home sharing consecutive? Is the 6-month residency period consecutive? Let me read that one more time. Are the 120 days allowed for home sharing consecutive? Is the 6-month residency period consecutive?
The 120 days can be spread out through the entire calendar year. And the 6 months, no, for residency, it does not have to be consecutive. You just spent 6 months within the year period.
Okay. This is another question about registration. I have an LLC. Can I have multiple
That was
listings?
somebody's question.
How does it work for companies?
Companies can't
Again,
be.
if a site is to be used for short-term rentals, it must be the primary residence of an individual, that being a live person. When a property is held in an LLC, we'll look at who is listed as the partners. Technically, those are the owners. So when you register, you would list the name. It could be John Smith. Okay, we will check that. If the LLC has John Smith as an owner, they qualify as an owner, but at the same time, they have to prove residency. That partner, John Smith, has to have the ID with the address and the matching documents to prove that is his primary residence. The other partners could not then register that site as their primary residence. Thank you.
Okay. There are a couple of questions about RSO exemptions. So basically, the question is, where does the ordinance state that RSO exemption guidelines are not applicable for short-term rentals? So let's find the question here.
So the question is, where does the ordinance state RSO exemption guidelines are not applicable? Okay, I'm going to make an assumption. When people talk about the RSO exemption, that's an exemption that's issued by the housing department. That exemption, it's probably a certificate you see that says exemption, that exempts you from the housing department's inspection fee and the actual inspection itself. Owner-occupied rental units typically apply for this because the owner doesn't need his unit inspected by housing and doesn't want to pay the $89 for the inspection. That is what's called the RSO exemption. There is no exemption, certificate or otherwise, that takes you out of the short-term rental ordinance.
Okay, great. Bob, there are a couple of questions here about extended home sharing. Can you go over the fees and maybe how that's calculated and when that's paid? Just to clarify.
Extended home sharing, you obviously cannot qualify for extended home sharing until after you've done regular home sharing for at least 60 nights, or you've held that registration number for 6 months. After that, you can apply for extended home sharing. The fee for extended home sharing, the initial application, is $850. You go to the same website where you registered originally. There's a little active button there. They're going to ask you to update your information. And from there, they walk you through the steps for extended home sharing. Key there is the abutting property owners get a notification that you've applied for extended home sharing. We will provide you with the mailing labels and also with the notice that will be mailed to the residents. You will use a city issued vendor, BTC, to do that mailing. Again, it is just a notification. This is not something the neighbors can appeal, object to. It is just notification. That approval is ministerial, meaning as long as you have no citations, you will be approved. And again, the fee is $850. It's good for 1 year from the time it's issued for full-time, full-year rentals. The renewal fee for that is $850 per year. We had a workshop last night, and there was a little confusion. I think we had said the renewal fee was $89. There was some confusion based on the guidelines and how we interpreted them, but it is based on the ordinance, $850 renewal. And again, it is ministerial. However, when you apply, if you receive 2 or more citations on your property, at that point, it can be discretionary. We can hold a hearing, and the fee for that is approximately $5,600. And again, that's a little more labor intensive because, again, there's something going on the property that it's receiving citations. But again, if you have no citations or maybe just 1 citation, it's just ministerial for extended home sharing. Thank you.
Okay, and just kind of continuing on that information about registration. This question came in about affidavits needed for landlord permission. The question is asking, the affidavit of landlord's permission required for registration. Who should appear before the notary public? Is it the tenant or the landlord?
Okay. The affidavit is something that proves to us that the landlord is giving the tenant permission to do short-term rental on the property. That affidavit has to be signed by the landlord in the presence of a notary public. It is not the tenant. So you can mail it, hand it to the landlord. They take it at their discretion, their timeline, sign it with a different notary, and then they'll bring it back to you.
Great. There's a question here about ADUs. The question is, can an ADU be rented for 365 days a year?
Pre-2017.
As long as the ADU qualifies to be used for short-term rentals, and then after it meets the initial 120 days of having the registration number or 60 days of short-term rentals, you can convert it to an extended home sharing request. Absolutely. You just have to qualify and go through the process. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. This one's about a complaint. So the question is asking, if I already filed a complaint against illegal short-term rental back in July 25th exactly, against some of my neighbors, would that complaint apply as one of the citations? Or does it have to be a complaint that's received after November 1st?
Okay, a complaint and a citation are 2 different items. A complaint, you could be having an issue with noise with the neighbors or other activities. A citation is something that is written by either Building and Safety, LA Fire, LA Police, or the Housing Department. Those are considered citations. If they're written against the property, issued to the host, and they're sustained, meaning even if the host appeals them, they're still sustained, those count against the property when they're applying for extended home sharing, excuse me. The initial registration, the shorter one, citations only apply there if they're open at the time of registration. Once the citation is resolved by paying the fine and closed or fixing the infraction, then it does not count against your initial registration. But it still will count if you try to apply for extended home sharing for a period of 3 years back.
Okay, great. There are a couple of questions, and I know you went over this, Bob, but maybe we can just be extra clear. There are a couple of questions that came in about short-term versus long-term. So I want to be clear about 30 and below and 31 and more. So can you just clarify what it means to be short-term rental versus what it means to be long-term rental and not subject to the short-term rental ordinance, or the home sharing ordinance, rather?
Again, the ordinance just regulates short-term rental activity. That's any transactions that are occurring for 30 days or less. So if you're doing it just for the weekends or a few nights, that's considered short-term rental. If you're allowing someone to stay there for 31 days or more, or for 2 months, 3 months, 4 months at a time, that is not short-term rental, that's regular rental housing. All we are tracking and all that counts against your 120 days is your short-term rental activity, not the long-term rental activity. And again, to do long-term rental activity, you are not required to have a registration number, but if you do one short-term rental activity, you are required to have a registration number.
Okay, here's an interesting one. This question is asking, can I have a registration in Los Angeles and another city like Inglewood at the same time?
Absolutely. This ordinance only applies for activity you have in the city of Los Angeles. If you own property in other cities, countries, or wherever, those locations could regulate your activity, but it doesn't conflict or apply or blend with the city of Los Angeles. Thank you.
Okay, just kind of go into some of these questions. Let's see here. Here's one. Okay, my complaint is about a unit being used for home sharing in which the host does not reside. As a neighbor, can I file this type of complaint?
Yes, you can file that type of complaint after November 1st with the Department of Building and Safety or call it into our hotline. However, we do have to validate that that is occurring. And the way we would have to do that is, have they tried to register with us? If they've tried to register with us and we've declined it, then they're violating short-term rentals without the registration number, and that's how we would proceed with the ACE program against that property. If they've registered and somehow submitted false documents, we can review those documents, but we would have to see if they're false documents or not. It's very difficult sometimes if a person wants to circumvent that residency requirement. People get very creative, but for the most part, it's pretty easy to prove. People do have the information we need. We do not typically allow them to submit other forms of information. The ones identified in the ordinance and our administrative guidelines we found pretty much prove that it's a resident that lives there. Thank you.
Okay, great. We had a couple of questions come in that are asking about numbers to call, and so what we've done is put up on the screen some contact information. So there are some phone numbers there that anyone with questions are encouraged to reach out to and give a call, and we can answer some follow-up questions. Oh, we also put our email up there. So, sometimes folks are not at their desk and able to answer their phone, but we have a general email there for home sharing. It is planning.homesharing home-sharing at lacity.org, and that's up on the screen for folks. So, we're going to try to get to all our questions. We do have many, many questions. So if we aren't able to get to it tonight, please send an email and we will respond to your questions. But let's go with a few more. So let's see here. There's a question about maximum stays. Is there any max stay length
Oh
for
my
the long-term
God.
rental activity? This is outside of the home sharing ordinance, but maybe just clarify, is there a maximum stay length for long-term activity?
Dumb question.
Long-term activity, I'm going to assume, is you've rented month to month to groups of individuals. People can live there as long as they want to live there. There's people who've lived 20 years in one location as a rental. That's fine.
Okay. A clarification about the extended home sharing and the fee structure. Is $850 for those who have large buildings or bed and breakfast, or for a regular rental home, not home sharing? Can you please clarify? So I think the question is about, is that fee related to the size of your short-term rental?
Okay, that fee, $850, only pertains to the request to do extended home sharing. Now, whether you're doing extended home sharing in a bedroom or an entire home doesn't change the fee structure. If you have a B&B or a regular home that you're renting for more than 31 days, those don't have to be registered for short-term rentals, so that fee would not apply to them.
Okay, great. Just going through some of these questions. Sorry, I'm just reading through some of these. Let's see here. I have 2 concurrent Airbnb reservations booked for December. Do I have to cancel one of them?
Unfortunately, you cannot execute two separate bookings simultaneously at one location if you've registered with the city short-term rental ordinance. So you would have to make different arrangements for one of those bookings, yes.
Okay, thank you. There's a question here about notification. The question is, what does adjacent and abutting residences mean for the notice?
Okay, the simplest way to describe this is you've got your property. Anyone else who has a property that touches yours, that's considered adjacent or abutting. In addition, across the street, anyone directly in front of you or catty corner would also be considered adjacent or abutting. Typically on a single-family home, you would look to the right, to the left, those are abutting. Directly behind you, those are abutting. And catty corner to the corners of your parcel, those would be abutting. And then you would look across the street, that property would be adjacent or abutting also. Thank you.
Okay. There's a question here. It's a little long, so I'm going to put it up there, Bob, so you can see it. It says, I live in a 218-unit property. 167 units were used solely for Airbnb activity in the last 2 years. One commercial operator had more than 50 units rented at the time, doing solely short-term rental out of those units.
Wow.
Those commercial operators are still operating at the property, and the owner knows about it and does nothing to stop it. In this situation, will you be able to act against the landlord for allowing those violators to operate?
Currently, again, only the primary resident could have a home sharing number and do short-term rentals. So it would have to be a tenant of one of those units who would be allowed to do it. The description that you gave was you've got one landlord who's holding all 167 units for short-term rental. That would not be permitted at all. When those are verified, we would be issuing warning letters and citations, starting with the property owner and then working up to the actual person who's doing the hosting. But yeah, those are the ones, or the type of operations we would be moving against. Thank you.
Okay. Bob, there was a question here, I think more about registration. So the question is asking about the URL. It says they're a bit confused about a statement that said that a person would have to provide a URL for more than one listing. Can you clarify how one registers and putting up the URL?
Okay, one URL, more than one listing. Typically, okay, this is many people will have a short-term rental. They'll put it on different platforms, 3 different platforms to increase exposure. You would use that same registration number for each of those platforms. When you register, you would use the URL for each of those individual platforms into your registration. Let us know where you're doing this. But basically, you're using that same number across platforms, which is permitted. Thank you.
Okay. Question came in about primary residence. Should be a fairly straightforward answer. The question is, if the unit is not your primary residence, do you still register to be able to do short-term rentals?
No, unfortunately, the limitation of
That's
primary
a hard
limitation is
no.
you can only do short-term
Oh,
rentals
that's a hard
in your
no.
primary
You got me?
residence. Thank you.
Okay. The question came in. It says, you stated that it is illegal to advertise or list a short-term rental without registration. Is it also illegal to use a unit for short-term rental without being registered, even if there is no advertising?
Yes, it is. We use the advertising and the registration numbers a way for us to be able to track that, but even the activity of short-term rental without the registration would be considered out of compliance with the
Right.
ordinance.
Anytime you do STR, you need to have a number.
How would they know? Unless it's like
Okay, I think you may have gone over this one, but let's ask it again. How are you guys actually enforcing is the question. How are you identifying people who have not registered or haven't done it properly?
Ooh.
Again,
We have this big brother called
what
post
we have is
compliance.
a third-party vendor who goes out and looks at all these platforms and looks for people advertising who do not have a registration number. If you do not have a registration number and you're advertising on a platform, those are the ones we are going to approach and send citations or warning letters of
Did you
violation.
vacuum
In
already?
addition, platforms themselves,
Huh?
to be compliant with our ordinances, would normally pull those registration numbers, registration, not registered sites down. That's how enforcement would work.
Thank you. I'll give you a minute. Okay, there's a question that's come in a few times, same question. So let's make sure we get this one answered. The question is, do you monitor long-term rental in the same house with a short-term rental?
What?
No, we do not monitor long-term rental. That is not covered by this ordinance. That is not something we're involved in.
Okay. It's a question about existing reservations. So the question is, I have an existing long-term 61-night reservation, which ends November 30th of this year. Since September 30th. Okay, so the rental went from September 30th through November 30th. Am I going to be okay? So this is asking about long-term rental through November 30th. Are they going to be okay to continue this reservation?
Again, that long-term rental, one stretch, one group, 61 nights is not considered short-term rentals and is not regulated by the short-term rental ordinance. So that activity would not be a conflict with our ordinance, no.
Okay, great. Another one about listings. With a valid registration for one home that has 2 rooms, can both rooms be rented to separate guests at the same time?
No, that's part of the ordinance structures. Only one, you can rent 2 rooms, describe them differently, but you cannot have guests from separate transactions arriving at the same time. They can be one week, another the other week, but they cannot overlap or be the same week.
Okay. So the question has come in about calculating the number of days. So the question says, since the ordinance went into effect mid-year, how do you calculate the 6-month residency requirement in 2019? Do you start all over again in 2020 so that hosts essentially get a free ride for 2019?
I'm not sure what you would consider a free ride for 2019, but when they submit their documents, all we are checking is for residency. And residency is, again, with those documents, typically we tell you you should be living there at least 6 months. Now that's going to be for the full year. So it's not really a free ride. We just want to, again, confirm that they are a permanent resident of that unit or home. Thank you.
Let's see. So question is a little more nuanced. This question is about ages of guests. So the question's been asked. Airbnb categorizes children as 2 to 12 years old, and 13 through 17 years old are categorized as adults. So that means a family of 4 with 2 teens would be considered 4 adults. The question is stating that it is a bit unclear that the group cannot be booked by a listing that can take 2 adults and 2 minors under 18 but over 12. Or does the city consider 13 through 17-year-old adults too? So maybe go over what our existing regulations states, just maybe clarify that for folks.
Okay, Airbnb has their standards on how they look at occupancy ages. The city's ordinance basically just has one cutoff, 18 and over. 18 and over is considered adults, under 18 are minors or children. When you're looking at the habitable space, it's 2 adults per room, habitable room. You would not include people under 18 to be in compliance with our ordinance. If Airbnb has different requirements or definitions, that's between the host and Airbnb.
Okay, great, thank you. Can you talk a little bit about, this may have been reviewed in the presentation, but a little bit about the hotline and how the hotline works when someone calls and records a complaint?
The purpose of the hotline, again, it's a 24/7 hotline manned by host compliance. Again, the intent of the hotline is to allow people to call when there is an issue at a registered host site when it's occurring, whether it's 3 in the afternoon or 2 a.m. A person would typically call the hotline, a live person answers, you would describe the issue you have with that property, they will look it up. If it's a registered host, they have the ability to contact that registered host and let them know of the issue. Typically it's going to be a noise issue sometimes. They would tell the host that's the issue. They would also confirm that the host received this phone call. They have 30 minutes to resolve the problem. The original caller will get a call back in 30 minutes asking them if the issue was resolved. If it was, that's good. If it was not, then the caller is asked if they would like to be transferred to a non-emergency police number. And if they say yes, then you're fed into that system so you can have a police officer or unit come out to the site and try to address that situation. Thank you.
Okay. Another question about registration, the number of days, and how to qualify. So the question is, do you count the 120 days starting from the date of registration?
Yes, we do. All activity starts from the time you register.
And we got a follow-up question for you, Bob. Oh, okay. Uh-oh. I think I lost the question. A follow-up age question here. Follow-up on the age question. How will host compliance know the teens are present on the reservation? People ages are not disclosed, but guests can only choose children 2 through 12. Everyone else is recorded as an adult.
Okay. One thing, when you register, you're agreeing to comply with certain code conducts and other requirements when you register. A lot of this program relies on self-certification. Hosts are agreeing to comply with this activity. We do not send inspectors out to check occupants, to check activities. Again, it is a self-certification process. Now, if complaints are occurring, again, 2 a.m., and you've got a ton of teenagers out on a balcony creating a problem, that's going to bring attention to the site. Then you might have some sort of inspection occurring. But typically, it's all self-certification.
Okay. So question here, it says, I've seen some listings now say that their unit is exempt from this ordinance because they have a transient occupancy residency, also known as TORS. How is it possible, a transient occupancy residency structure, also known as TORS. How is it possible to get this designation, or is this considered a fraudulent claim?
Okay, that's not so much a designation as that's the way the structure was built and designed at that time. You could not take an existing building and convert it to a TORS building. Yes, TORS are exempt from this short-term rental ordinance, and a good way to think of a TORS is hotels are exempt, and so are hostels. A TORS is something that operates between a hotel and a hostel, and that's why it was exempt. If they're advertising themselves that way and do not have a registration number, that's fine, but we would probably still look into it to confirm it's a TORS if we got a complaint on that property. Thank you.
Okay, I think just following up on that complaint question, recent question came in. What protections do hosts have against neighbors who bring unwarranted claims repeatedly because they simply don't like the idea of short-term rentals? So a bit about verification of those claims.
Again, currently people can complain about their neighbors, and again, if there's a bad relationship, you have neighbors calling against neighbors every other week. It could happen against short-term rentals too. However, if we're investigating or building and safety is going out there to look at the complaint, it has to be valid. If it's not valid, you will not receive a violation. You will not receive a citation as a host. But again, there's nothing to stop a neighbor from filing a complaint or requesting an investigation. That is their prerogative. But again, when the city goes out there, it does have to be a valid issue for us to issue a citation. Thank you.
Okay. Let's see. There's a question here about, where did that go? Let's see here. Sorry, folks, we're just going through a lot of questions. Does the short-term rental ordinance have the right to differentiate between types of primary residences? I'm not sure what that exactly is asking, but maybe, Bob, if you can clarify. Yeah, so maybe if you could just clarify what it means to be your primary residence, and how that's proven at time of registration.
When you say different types of primary residence, there's really only one. you live there 6 months or more, and that is your primary residence. Now, whether it's an apartment, accessory structure, a primary home, large home, small home, that doesn't make a difference. You still have to show it's your primary residence. You're living there a minimum 6 months a year.
Okay. Let's see here. There's another question about RSO, so units that are subject to the rent stabilization ordinance. So the question is really asking again, Bob, just to maybe clarify another time. I know this is it's been repeated a couple of times, but to go over that exemption and why that would not exempt you from being able to short-term rent.
Again, the exemption most people have for a rental piece of property owner occupied is one that's issued by the Department of Housing. That exemption, excuse me, exempts you from their inspection program, also the $89 fee for the cost of that inspection program. That's built in within the rent stabilization ordinance. The short-term rental ordinance itself is separate from that. It uses RSO as a criteria for restricting the activity. So the exemption that's given to you not to be inspected by housing does not apply to the short-term rental regulations apply to you. They are two separate ordinances. Thank you.
Okay. Let's see here. There's another question here about maybe a landlord. Let's ask this question. It says, how about a landlord that knows that its residents are doing short-term rentals that are not their primary residence, such as corporate clients? So I guess this is speaking to maybe how enforcement of those situations will occur, and how will the city be checking in on those situations where it's more of a commercial activity and not someone's primary residence that they're listing for short-term rentals.
Again, you must be the primary resident if you want to receive a registration number. So if you get a registration number, it's because you've proven to us, whether it's owned by a corporation or otherwise, that the primary resident is the owner and is living there. Now let's assume that activity is occurring and there is no registration number. It's just listed like that. Now, regardless whether it's a corporation or an individual who owns it, they will be pursued, and it starts with sending out the warning letters to the property owners and eventually a citation. But we don't distinguish whether it's LLC, a corporation, or an individual. You must show you are the primary resident, and you must have a registration number. Thank you.
Okay, Bob, this is a little bit different question, but it does kind of speak to the general sense of questions that we're getting. The question is speaking more to the rationale, so maybe we can explain a little bit about how the city landed with the regulations that prohibited all properties that are identified as being subject to the rent stabilization ordinance from being able to host for through the home sharing ordinance or short-term rentals.
Okay, the ordinance, again, the motion was introduced in 2015. The actual ordinance wasn't adopted until 2018. That was 4 years of 4 years of discussions, policy discussions among the council, among the community groups, to land on what should be used and should not be used. The rent stabilization ordinance basically tries to somehow restrict the rent levels that can be applied on a piece of property. People are benefiting from that, and it's encouraging affordable housing to some degree. They wanted to preserve that. They don't want that to be taken off the market and turned into short-term rentals. They want to encourage people to use those properties for long-term housing. And that is why properties that are under the rent stabilization ordinance are felt to be protected from short-term rentals, which again eliminates long-term housing.
Oops, okay, sorry, I was on mute there. So there's a question here. Says websites such as booking.com and Craigslist do not require registration numbers. So would that give hosts a way to continue renting short term without registering with the city?
They will be.
No, all platforms, regardless who they are, Booking.com, Craigslist, have to have a registration number if a host is going to advertise on there. What'll happen if they don't accommodate that registration number on the listing is it'll be identified and we'd be contacting the property owner or the host that they're in violation of the ordinance. Of course, if they come up and show us their registration number, then we're probably going to have to work with the platform and encourage them to let them place that registration number somewhere on their listing so the city doesn't constantly contact the host for proof.
Okay. And Bob, can you place a fake registration number next to your listing?
Absolutely, you can place a fake registration number, but I think the question is, will we catch it? Yes, we will. When, as part of the scanning process, we are looking for blank registration areas. That's fine, but we're also looking at the registration numbers that exist regularly. Host compliance is at checking it against our legally registered numbers on a nightly basis, and you can easily then compare those two lists and find out which number is not appropriately issued. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. But there's a question on here. Looks like there's a little bit confusion about primary residence and being able to long-term rent, and maybe this speaks to
home sharing units,
something
planning
being your
home
primary
sharing.
residence, and you still being able to long-term rent, say, a bedroom out of your unit. So, if it's someone's primary residence, could they still do long-term renting in that unit or in that, I guess, structure?
Okay, yes. Yes, you can do if it's it's going to always have to be your primary residence. You do have to live there 6 months of the year. The extended home share, remember, there are some people who just rent one bedroom all year round. That is considered extended home sharing. They are still living in their home, but it's just that one bedroom constantly has people coming in and out. I know there's a lot of people out there who rent the entire house, and those people, if they try to do extended home sharing, won't be able to do that as easily because obviously they have to be in their home at some point for a period of 6 months, either consecutively or throughout the year, but a minimum of 6 months throughout the year. So the extended home sharing on a single-family home or other properties really would lend itself to people who share a portion of their residence all year round. It really is not practical or feasible for someone who wants to do their entire home all year round because obviously then they are not the primary residence and could not live there 6 months out of the year. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Bob. There are some questions continuing to come up about RSO units that are owner occupied, and we did want to restate. This was talked about in the presentation. There are a couple of pending motions being discussed at the council level that would potentially revisit regulations as they relate to the rent stabilization ordinance. Specifically, there's discussions about being able to short-term rent a structure that is subject to the that is subject to the rent stabilization ordinance, if it's potentially owner-occupied, or
hindi
if it's
magplaplat, Joanne.
and if it's a smaller structure, so say a multifamily building that has 4 or fewer units. There are discussions about how the city could potentially allow short-term rentals in these sort of small-scale owner-occupied, tenant-occupied RSO units. That said, those are not the existing rules, so we do just want to clarify that regardless of your particular status within an RSO unit, if your property is identified as being subject to the RSO, to the rent stabilization ordinance, you are not permitted to participate in the home sharing ordinance. So we did just want to clarify that. We know there's some frustration with that, but We do encourage you to follow along with these pending motions, and we had them highlighted in the presentation. What we plan to do is send a follow-up email to folks who participated in tonight's webinar, and we'll create a link to those particular motions so that you can stay up to date on how those motions progress. You can be notified anytime something gets scheduled or discussed, and you can also submit comments to those, and those would go directly to council offices, and so they can be made aware of your opinions on the matter and as those sort of progress through the legislative process. So that said, we have a couple of other questions. Bob, the question came up about grace periods. So can you just, I know you stated this previously, but the question is about grace periods and warning letters up to an actual citation. So maybe just go over that for folks who didn't maybe get it the first time.
Okay, I would not call any of it a grace period. Enforcement starts November 1st. At that point, our third-party consultant, Host Compliance, will start scanning the web and looking for sites that do not have a registration number. As those sites are collected, they'll be sent over to our department. We'll review them. If they're found to be legitimate sites within the city of LA without a registration number, we are going to send out a warning letter or a notice encouraging them to register. Maybe they forgot, maybe they don't know about this program. We're going to encourage them to register. Period after that, it could be a few days, a couple of weeks. We're working on other citations. If they're still listing and they continue to do that, we would send them a second letter letting them know these are the fines that could be levied against the property that's not registered. Again, we're trying to encourage compliance with the ordinance. We're sending these letters out to educate people on how to register, when to register, and why to register. Of course, if after a couple letters they are still advertising without the number, it will be turned over to the ACE program where they will get an actual citation. That does have fines associated with it. The fines are about $500 per event or 2 times the rental rate. City attorney then takes over and follows up with that citation, and the host or the property owner has to work it out with the city attorney. But again, there is no grace period. Enforcement will start November 1st. Thank you.
Okay. So we are getting close to 8, but we have a few more questions. Let's see here. This question is about, looks like it's about illegal conversion. So Bob, the question is, I know neighbors that have non-permitted conversions of their garages and they short-term rental those units. They have a registration number because they claim it's a room in their house. How will the city catch these operators? Because it seems unfair to people who legally paid to have their accessory dwelling units constructed.
Okay, there's 2 items here. There's accessory dwellings and ADUs. ADUs are a state entitlement. Every city must allow a property owner of a single-family home to put an ADU on their property. When it's built, it's labeled as ADU, accessory dwelling unit. Those can be home shared, short-term rentals, if they qualify. Other structures that you can use are the accessory structures, and there's a variety of those if they're built to habitable standards. Okay, so it does not have to be just an ADU. It could be an accessory structure that's built to habitable standards, and that's up to building and safety. They have code requirements for that. So there are alternatives. People do convert garages to habitable standards or rec rooms to habitable standards and use those for short-term rental. So it is, in many cases, acceptable to do that type of activity. Of course, what we don't want to see is people who just throw up a illegal structure completely. Those we're probably going to get complaints on from neighbors of the activity going on there. Building and safety will go out, do an inspection, check for permits, and they will probably get cited. But again, accessory structures, as long as they're habitable per code, can be used for short-term rentals, and those are identified separate than ADUs, which also could qualify for short-term rentals. Thank you.
Okay. I think this one is about again about registering and registration. Question is, when registering a unit in the primary residence, the habitable rooms count, is it just for the listing or for the entire house?
Well, it's however you're going to describe it in your listing. If all you're doing is one bedroom, and that's what you're putting on your listing, your habitable count will be for that one bedroom. If it's the entire house or half the house, then you count it that way. Again, it's depending. What are you using for short-term rental? The space, count that for your habitable rooms, whether it's the entire house or one bedroom, half the house. It's up to you to take the count on what you're short-term renting. Thank you.
Well, Bob, just to follow up to that, Bob, one could potentially have multiple listings, right, where they have their whole house registered as a listing, and then they could have another listing, same registration number, but it's just for one bedroom of that house. Maybe that's kind of the question. Oh, that was a yes. He nodded.
Yes.
Folks, he nodded at me.
No, yeah, I agree with that.
Okay, let's see. The question is about accessory dwelling units. It says, accessory dwelling units have a different address from the main home. Can they be Airbnb'd by two different family members?
No, one location can only have one registration number on that site. And again, it's based on not the address, but is it your primary residence? And secondly, on one single property, individuals in a family cannot get a registration number for, say, one bedroom, one accessory unit, and the upstairs. It's one number for one listing for the entire property. Thank you.
Okay, the question came up about listing without a registration number. So is it a problem to actually have a listing listed without a registration number, or a problem if someone actually stayed? So in other words, can someone be fined for having a listing but not actually having hosted?
Yes. If you want to register, if you're a host and you want to register on a site for short-term rental, you have to have that registration number. Your violation will be that you are listing without the registration number. Thank you.
Another question here. I think sort of related. It says, if you are not charging money, but perhaps doing a barter or for free, like with couch surfing, does this fall under the regulations?
Okay, now you're kind of going into the gray area. But again, what we're looking at is, are you listing on a platform for short-term rentals, and whether you're being paid in, popcorn or actual cash? That is not the host's violation. The violation is that you're listing short-term rentals on a site without the registration number. Okay, it is not the actual cash that's being exchanged that is the violation. Thank you.
Okay. Get this one. All right, folks. I think we're gonna wrap it up in about 5 minutes or less, because the questions we're getting in are sort of questions that we've answered already. And like I said, we're also happy to follow up if you have any specific questions. We've gone to about 4 meetings we've done in person, and I will say that we have a lot of unique situations out there, and so we do encourage folks to submit those questions to our home sharing email, because we understand there are many different situations throughout the city of LA, and the effort of this presentation is to try to answer as many questions, but we understand that we are not able to answer all of those questions. We also have a few more upcoming in-person information sessions throughout the city. So next week we will be at the Pio Pico Branch Library in Koreatown. The following week we will host a session downtown, and then that same week, we're going to be in South LA at Angeles Mesa Branch Library. So we do encourage you to attend there if you have follow-up questions, if you'd like to speak to somebody in person. But of course, you can also submit your questions via email if that's more convenient for you. We will also be posting tonight's webinar on our website, and so we'll send email to folks to make sure you know how to properly access that. So just a few more questions, Bob, and I think we'll wrap it up tonight. Let me just go through some of these. So a question came in: will the 120 days of short-term rentals transform within 1 year and extended short-term rentals allowing 365 days? Does that question make sense? Let's see.
Okay, I'm not sure what the question is, but let's assume you're registering this year. You would start registering for regular registration. You get 120 days this calendar year to do short-term rentals. Your registration would carry over for the next year, say July 1. You get another 120 days through July 1. Of course, if you did all of your rentals in the beginning of the year, you have nothing left to do the rest of the calendar year. You renew your registration, but again, you have no more days left. At that point, we would encourage you to apply for the extended home sharing program, because then you can continue the year beyond the allotted 120 days.
Okay, thank you. Question, more technical question here. Do you have to submit paperwork for sales tax if Airbnb collects the taxes?
Okay, I'm assuming you're speaking to the TOT tax. If you're on a platform that collects that and submits it to the city, you don't have to worry about that. Your platform will take care of that. You're only responsible for that if your platform does not transmit that for you. Okay.
Okay. So I just have to do the toilet and the sink, and then just replenish all the
Okay.
supply stuff.
I think we went over this question
Vacuum.
about your primary residence versus habitable
So
rooms.
there's
But
three.
Bob, real quickly, again, can you, I know we have in our presentation how you can find out if your unit is subject to the RSF, but what is the rule? What's generally the rule to find out, to know if your unit is subject to the rent
They don't
stabilization
understand
ordinance?
English.
The rent stabilization
they're gonna-
ordinance was
I'm gonna
adopted
tell them,
in
oh, talk to her.
1978, and basically that
Okay.
is where they
Paano
set
yan?
the
You
mark.
have to talk to
Any
them in French.
structure,
Naku, paano?
multifamily structure,
paano
two dwelling
French
units
na?
or more on a lot, that was built prior
So,
to
doko-
1978 falls under the rent stabilization
Sinabi ni
ordinance,
Henry
and
sa
that's
akin.
implemented through the housing department. Anything built after that period does not fall under the rent stabilization ordinance, and that's kind of like the clean break.
Okay, Bob, I think you're off the hook. I think we've reached the end of our questions. But again, like I said, we do encourage you to submit your questions via email to our home sharing email address. It should be up on our screen.
Alright, so
We want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. We really appreciate the opportunity to allow the city to clarify some of these questions. We do understand it can be a confusing ordinance, and a lot of our regulations, they're worth clarifying, and so we're happy to do that. But again, just want to thank everybody for participating. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Matt. And thanks everybody else for joining us. Have a good night, everyone.
I got all my questions answered.
I got all my questions partially, sort of answered.
So in questions, like she kept saying, like, oh, we have so many questions, but like if I could send a question and within like a minute they're answering it.
Yeah,
If people
they
aren't
don't have.
sending questions, or they're totally cherry picking. Well, the 850 ended up being a fall.
Yeah.